He was the kind of man who thought money could buy everything: respect, attention, even talent. Known for his arrogance and flashy lifestyle, he loved nothing more than belittling those he saw as beneath him. At one of his grand parties, surrounded by polished guests and the glow of chandeliers, his sharp eyes landed on a quiet woman in the corner. She was simple, dressed modestly, and unlike the others, she didn't seem interested in impressing anyone. To him, she was the perfect target for his cruel amusement. With a sly smile, he called her forward, pointing to the gleaming piano in the center of the room. "Why don't you play something for us?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. Laughter rippled through the crowd as they waited to watch her falter. After all, what could a woman like her possibly know about performing in front of the wealthy elite? He was certain she would stumble, and her embarrassment would be his entertainment for the evening. But as she slowly walked toward the piano, something shifted in the room. The laughter softened into whispers, and even the arrogant man leaned forward, curious. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them on the keys, but her eyes carried a quiet strength. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She wasn't there to prove herself to him or his guests. Yet, in that moment, it was clear she was about to reveal a side of herself no one expected. The crowd leaned in, waiting for the sound of hesitation, waiting for her to fail. But instead, the first notes filled the room, and what happened next would leave everyone stunned, especially the man who thought he had already written the ending to her story. The music began softly, almost hesitant, but with each note, her confidence grew. The guests who had been smirking moments before now found themselves caught in an unexpected silence. The rich man leaned back in his chair, his smug grin fading just a little as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. This wasn't the sound of someone fumbling their way through a tune. This was skill, refined, emotional, and impossible to fake. What no one in that room knew was that the simple woman had grown up surrounded by music, long before life had humbled her. Before she had to set aside dreams for survival, she had spent countless hours practicing on an old, weathered piano in her small childhood home. She never spoke of it, because in her world, there was no point showing off to people who didn't listen. To her, music was not for applause. It was for the soul. Now, in this lavish hall where she was meant to be a source of mockery, her hidden gift was unfolding. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging surprised glances, others leaning closer as though pulled in by something they couldn't explain. The melody carried an intensity that seemed to paint stories without words, reaching corners of the heart untouched by wealth or status. The rich man's pride, however, would not let him admit he was impressed. Instead, he narrowed his eyes, trying to convince himself it was luck, or maybe just a trick. Yet, deep down, something about her playing unsettled him. It was more than talent. It was truth, and as her fingers danced across the keys, a question lingered in the air. How long could his arrogance stand against a gift so undeniable? The answer was coming, but not yet. The notes grew richer, filling every corner of the grand room, and for a moment it felt as if the air itself was vibrating with her music. Yet beneath the awe building in the crowd, tension simmered. The rich man could feel his authority slipping. This was supposed to be his stage, his moment to humiliate someone, but instead the spotlight had shifted. His guests, who once laughed at his cruel games, now leaned toward her, drawn in by the beauty of her talent. Among the onlookers, whispers began. Some wondered how a woman so simple could play with such mastery, while others quietly admired the courage it took to perform under such pressure. One guest, a music teacher who had once trained young pianists, studied her intently. He recognized the discipline in her movements and the emotion behind every note. For him, this was no accident. It was the mark of years of devotion, hidden beneath a quiet life. But not everyone was impressed in the same way. A few of the rich man's closest friends exchanged uneasy glances, worried that his carefully built image of power was crumbling. If a humble woman could outshine him in his own home, what would people say about him tomorrow? To them, reputation was everything, and this unexpected turn threatened to unravel it. The woman, however, seemed unaware of the shifting politics in the room. Her focus remained on the keys, her face calm, but her playing full of fire. With every passing moment, the contrast grew sharper, the arrogance of wealth against the honesty of art. The rich man clenched his jaw, determined not to let her steal his night. A plan was already forming in his mind. If her music could not be dismissed, then he would have to find another way to break her. The game was far from over. The room seemed to hold its breath as the woman's playing grew bolder, each note sharper, faster, as if her soul had been waiting years for this single moment. Guests who had arrived expecting nothing more than wine and shallow laughter now sat frozen, hearts pulled into the music storm. Some had tears in their eyes, though they couldn't explain why. It wasn't just talent anymore. It was truth laid bare on ivory keys. The rich man shifted in his chair, his fists tightening around the armrests. He could feel the respect of the room slipping from him, draining into her performance like sand through his fingers. His pride screamed for control, but every new chord only widened the gap between his carefully crafted image and the reality before everyone's eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had planned to expose her weakness, to show she didn't belong among the wealthy. Instead, it was his arrogance being exposed. Sensing the shift, he forced a laugh, loud enough to break the spell for a moment. "Impressive," he said, his voice sharp. "But anyone can play a tune they've practiced 1,000 times." His words echoed, but they sounded hollow, more like a plea than an insult. Still, he wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to turn the game darker. "Let's see if you can keep up when the challenge is real." The crowd stirred, torn between curiosity and unease. They knew him well enough to recognize the danger in his tone. Whispers spread quickly. What more could he demand from her? The woman did not flinch, her hands still resting on the piano, as though she had expected this. The tension rose, thick and unshakable. Something was about to break, and every eye in the room waited for the moment it would happen. The silence stretched as the rich man stood, his voice carrying across the hall. "If you truly believe you have talent," he declared, "then play something you've never practiced. Improvise. Create music on the spot, right here, in front of us all." His challenge rang out like a blade cutting through the air. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some eager to see her fail, others worried he was pushing too far. This was no longer about entertainment. It was a battle of pride and power. The woman sat still, her hands hovering over the keys. Improvisation was risky, unpredictable, and for a moment, the crowd thought she might refuse. The rich man's smirk returned, certain that his trap would finally expose her as ordinary. But then she closed her eyes, drew in a steady breath, and let her fingers fall. The room was struck again, this time by sounds they had never heard, raw, unplanned, but overflowing with emotion that seemed to pour from her very soul. As the haunting melody grew, the rich man's confidence faltered once more. He had expected stumbles, broken rhythm, failure, but instead she was weaving a piece that felt alive, as though the piano itself had been waiting for her touch. The audience leaned in, drawn tighter, caught between admiration and disbelief. Then came the twist no one saw coming. The music teacher in the crowd suddenly rose to his feet, his voice trembling with urgency. "I know this style," he said, eyes fixed on her. "This isn't just improvisation. This is the same brilliance I once saw in a prodigy who disappeared years ago." Gasps spread through the hall. Could this simple woman be the very pianist once whispered about in competitions, a talent believed lost to time? The woman kept playing, her expression unreadable, while the rich man's face darkened. The stakes had just risen far beyond his cruel game. The room fell into stunned silence as the teacher's words sank in. Eyes widened, whispers surged, and suddenly all the guests were looking at the woman in a completely new light. Could it be true? Could this quiet, modest woman be the once celebrated prodigy who vanished without explanation? The rich man's smugness cracked, his control over the evening slipping like water through his hands. For the first time, he wasn't the one commanding attention. She was. Her fingers never faltered. The melody swelled, filling the hall with a force that seemed larger than life. It was no longer a performance. It was a declaration. Every note told the story of her struggles, the sacrifices she had made, and the dreams she had buried. The crowd was entranced, swept away by the truth she poured into the piano. By the time the final chord echoed, there was no laughter, no mockery, only silence heavy with respect. The rich man forced himself to clap, his pride demanding he pretend it was all a show. But before he could spin his words, the teacher stepped forward again. This woman is not only talented, she is extraordinary, and tonight she proved that true greatness can never be mocked away. The guests erupted into applause, many rising to their feet. The man's plan to humiliate her had collapsed into his greatest humiliation. Yet just as the woman stood to leave, the unexpected twist came. She looked at the rich man, her gaze calm but piercing, and said softly, "You should know, I once played in this very house, years before it was yours. This piano belonged to my family." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The man's face went pale, his arrogance stripped bare. In one night, the balance of power had shifted forever, and the woman who came as a target left as the undeniable victor. The hall seemed to freeze after her words. Guests looked around, realizing that the piano they had admired all evening was more than just an ornament. It was a piece of her past, a symbol of what she had lost. The rich man, once so certain of his power, now stood exposed. His wealth could fill rooms with gold and light, but it could not silence truth. The revelation left him speechless, his pride crumbling in front of the very people he wanted to impress. The woman stepped away from the piano with quiet grace, her presence commanding more respect than any riches ever could. The music teacher, still shaken, approached her with tears in his eyes. "The world thought you were gone," he whispered. "Why did you disappear?" She smiled faintly and answered, "Life has a way of rewriting our stories. Sometimes you step away, not because the music ends, but because you must learn to hear it differently." Her words struck deeper than any melody, reminding everyone that greatness often lives in silence, waiting for the right moment to return. The guests, once complicit in the man's mockery, now applauded her with genuine admiration. They would leave that night not remembering his wealth, but her strength. For the first time, he had no control over the narrative, and the humiliation was his alone. As the crowd dispersed, she walked out into the night, leaving behind the echoes of her music and a lesson none would forget. True talent doesn't need permission to shine, and dignity cannot be mocked away. The piano, once a stage for arrogance, had become a voice for truth, and in that voice, the world was reminded that humility and art will always outlast pride and power.